Today, we examine documented kill counts from coalition member species. Does that include Earth's numbers? Yes, but per soldier. Morris didn't correct the laughter. Correction would come on its own. He pulled up the engagement archive and began with Karvathi infantry figures, which were genuinely impressive. A species that evolved under high-gravity conditions, their average frontline combatant was capable of sustained engagement across terrain that exhausted most other coalition infantry within hours. The numbers ran into the hundreds per career deployment. The room absorbed them with appropriate respect. The more 8 figures followed, comparable but with a different distribution across short engagements where their speed advantages concentrated similar totals. The Drainic data produced the same pattern of engaged attention from the class. Then Morris navigated to the human section and paused. "Before I display these," he said, and the room's residual amusement from Dvach's comment was still audible in the quiet, "I want to establish one context note. The Coalition's classification system assigns access tiers to military data based on operational sensitivity. Everything we've reviewed this session has been Tier 3 access. Standard curriculum material." Another pause. Human combat records from the Outer Corridor campaign were reclassified to Tier 7 shortly after the campaign's conclusion. A Velroni cadet in the back row frowned. "Why Tier 7? The working theory from the documentation committee," Morris said evenly, "was that unrestricted access to accurate figures would create unnecessary anxiety among coalition member species regarding a recently integrated partner. The committee's language, not mine." The room was quieter now than it had been. "What I'm authorized to show you is a redacted summary." Morris activated the display and one footage segment. The footage was included in the curriculum access package because it was deemed illustrative rather than alarming, which I'll leave you to evaluate independently. The redacted summary appeared on the screen first. Column after column of engagement data, with most individual entries hidden behind black redaction bars. What remained visible was a structural outline. Number of documented engagements, number of confirmed outcomes, campaign duration. The ratio between engagements and confirmed outcomes was, even with most of the individual figures obscured, arresting. Dvach had stopped looking amused approximately 45 seconds ago. The footage segment was 3 minutes and 17 seconds long, captured by a coalition monitoring drone during a defensive engagement at the Outer Corridor Station Verithnal, which Morris noted had been considered a lost position by Coalition Tactical Command at the time of recording. The human in the footage, documentation identified him only as an Earth Defense Force sergeant whose name remained classified, was alone in a corridor defending an evacuation route for 31 minutes against a raiding party whose numbers the drone's count placed at between 40 and 60 individuals across the engagement's duration. The camera work was the drone's automated tracking, which meant it followed movement without editorial judgment, capturing, without selection, what happened across those 31 minutes. Nobody in the room laughed. Somewhere around minute 12 of the footage, Dvach discovered he was sitting forward in his chair with both hands flat on his desk, and he didn't remember moving. The sergeant survived the engagement. This was visible in the footage's final 30 seconds. The evacuation route cleared. The hostile contact neutralized or withdrawn. The sergeant moved methodically through the aftermath with the systematic attention of someone checking work before moving to the next task. 31 minutes. 31 coalition civilians had reached the evacuation pod during that window. Morris let the footage end without commentary, then left the screen visible on the final frame, the sergeant's back to the drone, heading toward the pod corridor for approximately 20 seconds before returning to the neutral display. 2 digits. Dvach said very quietly, mostly to himself. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was a number being reconsidered. The classification exists, Morris said, not to protect humanity's reputation. That turned out not to require protection. He pulled up a single final slide. The documentation committee's actual rationale, unredacted, which curriculum access had approved for display after the footage was shown rather than before. The Tier 7 access was assigned because early access to unredacted figures was producing significant psychological impact on coalition partner species during integration discussions, and the documentation committee determined that framing context should precede raw data. A Theroni cadet in the back raised her hand. What's the unredacted figure for the sergeant in the footage that remains Tier 7? Morris closed the display. But I'll note that the footage you watched represents approximately 1/3 of that campaign deployment's documented timeline. Another pause. Calibrated. The drone ran out of battery at minute 31. The engagement continued. Nobody asked the follow-up question out loud, but every person in the room ran the calculation. The class ended without the usual background conversation of cadets beginning to pack up before dismissal. Everyone stayed seated until Morris formally concluded the session, and even then the movement toward the exit was slower than usual, with less ambient chatter than a room of 30 produced on any other day. Dvach was the last one out. He stood in the corridor outside the classroom for a moment, the kind of pause a person makes when they're revising something internally. His next training session was hand-to-hand combat. He arrived 10 minutes early, which he had never done before. His instructor noticed, said nothing about it, and privately updated his assessment profile with a notation that read, "Motivation recalibrated. Reason. See Combat History Session Record, current semester." The footage had done what the documentation committee had spent 18 months trying to accomplish through carefully worded briefings and managed information releases. 3 minutes and 17 seconds had accomplished it in an afternoon. Years later, that 3-minute and 17-second recording became required viewing at every coalition military academy. Not because it showed humanity winning a battle, but because it showed something far more important. It showed what determination looked like when retreat was no longer an option. New cadets often entered the classroom believing strength could be measured by numbers, size, or reputation. They always left understanding that the most dangerous opponent was the one who refused to quit. Because history rarely remembers those who talked about courage. It remembers the ones who stood their ground when everyone else believed the battle was already lost.